this is a great event. We're looking forward to it, and a great opportunity to be sort of like beginning a discussion on topics that have to do with citizenship and democracy. And I'm very, very happy to be collaborating with a good friend and a colleague from Citizen Tales Commons. Is that right? Am I saying that right?
Yes.
This is our first sort of like collaborative effort, and I'm very happy and honored to also be doing the presentation, and also to have this inaugural conversation and being under the name of Mr. George E. Danis, somebody that I know and respect, and also appreciate his encouragement, and also his love of the whole idea of citizenship and engagement and participation. So I'm very happy that we're here, just to let everybody know that we are recording this event. So everybody should be aware of that. And with that, I'm going to yield the floor temporarily to my good colleague and friend, Dr. Vasiliki Rapti.
Thank you so much, Petros, and welcome, a warm welcome from me as well to this inaugural George E. Danis Civic Tales annual lecture. The topic is why David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world is appealing today. And we want to honor our friend and supporter, Mr. George Danis, who is a successful businessman, entrepreneur, and philanthropist who has been politically active and has supported civic and education organizations which foster citizenship, democracy, and Hellenism. And Mr. Danis has consistently supported and recognized the achievements of those individuals or groups who have excelled in their professions or fields of endeavor. And we're lucky to have him with us today. And I'm also delighted that Mr. Professor Petros Vamvakas, my friend and colleague from Emmanuel College and director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, has kindly accepted to give this lecture, which focuses on remarkable people who made their landmark in the world history. So a few words about Professor Vamvakas, who is an associate professor of political science in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at Emmanuel College, where in 2018 he founded the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and since then he is the director of it. And the mission of the Institute is to promote and support the study of the Eastern Mediterranean and neighboring regions by building on the liberal arts mission of Emmanuel College and leveraging the academic and innovative power of Boston. Professor Vamvakas's work focuses on security and democratization, as well as issues related to identity and race and politics throughout the Americas. As part of his teaching, he has escorted groups of students to Crete, Greece, and Cuba, and he has recently worked on a new curriculum, on a new course, which is entitled "In the Footsteps of the Thucydides." Am I right, Petros?
Sure.
So there's so many things that we could say about his remarkable work, and we are honored to have you here today, Petros, and you all for being with us today. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually going to yield the floor to Mr. Danis if he wants to say a couple of words. I know his work on as I said, on this, and you mentioned this yourself, in the fact that he's been an active citizen, and I think that citizen is with a capital C. And I think one of his one of the goals and one of the dreams and one of the aspirations is to sort of like, push this ball forward. And I'm just very happy to be a part of that effort. So Mr. Danis, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, all. I want to congratulate Professor Vasiliki Raptis from the Citizen Tales Commons and Professor Petros Vamvakas, Director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies and Professor of Political Science, International Studies at Emmanuel College. I really want to thank you very, very much for this lecture from the historic David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world back almost 200 years ago, 1829. I'm very honored to have my name on this inaugural Civic Tales lecture on the significance of documented that was written by a freed slave almost 200 years ago. The points that Mr. Walker raises and are to be discussed today are still relevant. There is an important need for engaged citizenship, and that merit and honesty are attributes that are timeless. And without any more delay, welcome to all, and thank you again. Here's Professor Van Bakas to give us the whole lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. To start off a little bit, I just reshaped the title a little bit just to give us a sense of today's discussion. David Walker's appeal for the 21st century and the consciousness of the modern global citizen. In a sense, the argument that I want to put forth today is to what extent to place Mr. Walker within the context of today's reality, but put it in a historical perspective. As Mr. Danis and Professor Rapti mentioned, Mr. Walker is somebody that writes this pamphlet in a stunning period, in the period of the 1820s, which is a period of tremendous turmoil. So what I'm going to do today a little bit is to provide a little bit of a framing of the world that he writes this in, and some of the ideas that are pertinent or percolating at the time, in order for us to get a sense of what he is dealing with and what perspective he's coming from. So I'm going to sort of try to give you this framework and this PowerPoint presentation that I have, and I'm not going to read all of it and bore you with it, but just to give you some highlights. He sort of takes us through the prospect, and he brings us together from antiquity to today. I came across Mr. Walker last year or the year before as we're getting ready for the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, or the Greek Declaration, one of the declarations of independence that Greece had, the most successful of which was in 1821, which in 6 years later results in the autonomous Greek state. And everybody sort of looks at that period and sort of extrapolates things about ancient Greece and what that is to be, and the ideas of democracy and citizenship coming to the forefront in the 19th and 20th century. And then, in all of this, Mr. Walker's pamphlet gets lost. And when I read it for the first time, I was very, sort of in awe in the fact that he really looks at that history in a completely different way. And I'm just going to shed some light on that today and really highlight some of these elements for us and begin a conversation, if nothing else. So the themes that I'm going to look at immediately are, this whole idea of a social contract and the rise of the modern state or the modern democracy, and really how that ties into Athenian and Roman concepts of citizen versus the social contract notion of a citizen, which is somewhat different. And, Locke's inalienable rights versus civic engagement, and the whole notions of property and principles. We tend to look at all these things all in one big sense, and we use those words freely. But then by the time we get to the age of revolution, for what I'm going to look at today, Philadelphia, Haiti, and Greece, sort of looking at the American case from 1771, if you wish, or 3, depending on your starting point, the Tea Party, or the Declaration, all the way to Philadelphia, which is 1787, and the Constitution. Haiti, of course, in 1791, and Greece in 1820s. We see different types of democracies and citizenship, and what does that mean? And of course, what David Walker's experiences. It's this paradox of liberal democracy and slavery, something that really grabs them the wrong way. So when we talk about Athens and Rome, we tend to look at those things and we say Athens and Rome, and we forget that this is like, over 1,000 years worth of history. I mean, Rome, the Athenian golden age is from about 470 till about 404 BCE. So, it's about 2,500 years ago. And of course, Rome is, about 400 years later, all the way up to, if you want to say, the 4th century and the rise of Constantine and the Eastern Roman Empire. Regardless, we have like two different concepts of democracy or participation or representation. Athens is a democracy. It's a direct, in more like contemporary terms, Athens is a demos, is like a direct democracy. There's an assembly at Pnyx and the limited citizens all have a voice. Whereas Rome is a republic. It's a representative form of government, and it has different types of citizens. There are citizens that are also subjects. And that's a major sort of like distinction until we get to more modern sense, we jump another 1,000 years and we get to St. Thomas Aquinas about the 13th century and the whole notion of a social contract. And what's important about that, just in a general sense, is that Aquinas, along with Maimonides and Averroes, who were also, about 100 years apart, in the Iberian Peninsula, but Aquinas, in the Christian sense, sort of like brings us forth and marries antiquity, the whole notion of logos, the Aristotelian thought of the individual who has a thinking capacity and makes us different than the rest of the animal world, and the whole notion of free will to choose whether we do good or evil. And it's not like predetermined. It's up to us as human beings. And let's say, that sounds great, but it sort of like, begins a whole discussion in the 13th and 14th century Europe of how do we govern ourselves? How do we do this? How do we, if we take God away, if we take everything that we know of the past away, how do we sort of like govern ourselves? Which brings us to this whole notion of the age of social contract. Maybe for some of you is a repeat of like some class you took when you were in college or in high school. But the social contract idea, it's something that is the 17th century, about the 1600s. And you have sort of like three dominant notions that come up of how do we govern ourselves. We govern ourselves on the basis of a benevolent hegemon, somebody who is our father figure, who takes care of us, who makes sure that we don't die an unjustly death. Of course, that's a Hobbesian idea. Or, we have some kind of a state that we all participate in, and it guarantees our life, liberty, and property. And that's the Lockean idea. That's the idea that, we are most familiar with here in the United States, Locke being sort of like the foundational father of American political thought. And then you have the whole notion of a citizen, this whole idea of a general will. That everyone, regardless of their property and regardless of who they are, they have this noble savagery. They have a say of who they are because they're human beings. And that is, more or less Rousseau idea, something that we see in the French Revolution case. So without really getting into my political theory too much, I would say that this age of revolution really pins against one another, this idea of liberal democracy, Locke, and humanism, Rousseau, on the other. And we see a lot of Locke in the American case. The Americans sort of like the Boston Tea Party, the whole idea of like no taxation without representation, the whole notion that I have money and I need to guarantee my property, and thus I should have a say in my governance. That is a government by the people or by the citizens or by the ones that have ability to protect their interests, versus the more Rousseau argument of the French Revolution, the whole idea of fraternity and egalitarianism and the whole notion of give me bread, the whole idea of like, I need to survive. And the Haitian case, a revolution that we don't necessarily look at very much, which is the first of its kind, happens around the same time, 1789 to 1799. And it's the failure of the Napoleonic Wars that pretty much puts an end to the revolutions. And we have in 1815, the Congress of Vienna and the return of the Ancien regime, the whole notion of this European hegemons say enough with this revolution stuff. And this is where the Greek case is very, very important, because the Greek case takes place some 6 years later. Nobody told the Greeks that this is what's going to happen. So they sort of like, this is an unusual revolution in the fact that they are going against the dominant trend. And at the beginning is sort of like this revolution that captures the imagination, but also is viewed as something that people don't necessarily want. This is the period where our protagonist exists. This is the 1820s is the period where Mr. Walker is sort of like lives in. And I'll give you a little bit of background of the period here in Boston. What does that look like for Boston? But also about Mr. Walker himself before we get to his ideas. So we have this global thing that's going on, the rise of the modern state. We have a little bit of that historical background of how do we govern ourselves. And we also have here in the United States and in Boston in particular, we have the beginnings of a new state that was forged. 1787, the Constitution of the United States. 1791, the Bill of Rights. 1812, the war with Great Britain. So you have this sort of like, all kinds of like, fervor and all kinds of political argumentation. And in the middle of this, you also have a religious sort of confrontation about what type of a United States do we want? Do we want a United States that has a missionary zeal? It's the city on the hill. It's a country that's going to go out and civilize the rest of the world, and also, this whole notion of slavery, which is sort of like the original sin of the United States. And slavery has sort of like different components. You have people that are for slavery still, and then you have abolitionists, people who want to do away with the institution. But within the abolitionists, you have some abolitionists who are more radical than others, and you have some abolitionists that also believe in this whole idea of colonization, the whole idea of returning freedmen to Africa. So this is a period of tremendous turmoil and a lot of bigotry. And as the brand new state is trying to find its own footing, and it's constantly caught up with the idea of profit versus principle. The whole notion of, is the United States this country of free trade, which promotes liberal values and democracy, or is this country that God has chosen and put on the hill to provide the principles for the rest of the world? So this is something that we even feel today in many ways as being citizens of the United States. And we see it even in foreign policy decisions and choices, profit versus principle. And that's something that Mr. Walker grabs. And he writes this appeal in a historical context as the modern state deals with a market economy and slavery, and the whole notion of revolution and democracy sort of like in the backdrop. And then he deals with this 19th century reality for us, the 21st century significance. So who is David Walker? David Walker is somebody that moves to Boston in 1825. He's born in North Carolina. He's a free man. Born in 1796. He's a free man because his mother was free and his father is a slave. He's somebody who has a small store in Bradwell Street in Boston. saves up some money, buys a house. He's married. He has a couple of children. One of them actually dies of tuberculosis. And he's somebody that's well educated, who's well educated. He really knows, as we will go through his pamphlet, knows history. He is somebody who is well thought out. You know, he has a very philosophical perspective. And he's also, I would say, I would put this on the floor immediately, he is a real patriot. And he is a real believer of two fundamental concepts. He really believes in the teachings of Jesus Christ, and he also believes in the idea of democracy. He is somebody that sees almost, I mean, you can probably see him as a romantic today. You know, you would see somebody who, like, you know, he's willing to die for this cause. And this pamphlet, it is almost like a statement of, like, you know, writing his own death warrant, and in the fact that, you know, he's writing this in the middle of slavery. He's writing this at a time that he has a bounty on his head of $3,000 if he's brought dead, or if he's killed, or $10,000 if he's brought back to a southern state alive. So he writes this in 1829, and he dies in 1830 from tuberculosis. But he's sort of like, you know, it's really like a powerful statement that he makes here. I was intrigued by the title too. You know, he says this is an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. He uses the term citizens. You know, he uses the term citizens instead of the colored people or the colored subjects. And he has this notion of the world. So he's like this sort of, like, you know, transnational idea. At a time when, you know, this is the beginning of nation states, if you wish. This is a very transnational idea. So both those terms, you know, that's why I put them on there. And it has 5 parts, 4 articles, and a preamble. And the word that stays consistent is this idea of wretchedness. This whole notion that the modern world has rendered some people, some human beings that God has created as brutes. The whole notion of not redemption in the eyes of God is something that we see throughout, and it's a very powerful kind of a statement. And he writes this very radical pamphlet. I mean, this is radical by any measure, even by William Lloyd Garrison. And today I'm doing this presentation from the house of William Lloyd Garrison here in Roxbury. And William Lloyd Garrison, of course, you know, puts out a newspaper with Frederick Douglass, and he is a radical abolitionist. But even William Lloyd Garrison, when he reads this, sort of like writes an op-ed, and he's, you know, he says, well, it's a little bit too far. You know, it's not something that I can condone. And, you know, and I will give you some, I'm not going to read all of it, obviously, but just some parts that stick out I will give from each section, just to, like, you know, make the points that I want to bring forth for you. And I'm very cognizant of the time, so I will go as fast as I can. But the question that he raises in the preamble, I find to be important. And he says, can our condition be any worse? Can it be any more mean and abject? If there are any changes, will there not be for the better, though they may appear for the worst at first? And then he finishes this question. It says, but against all accusations which may or can be preferred against me, I appeal to heaven, to God, from my motive in writing. Who knows that my object is, if possible, to awaken in the breast of my afflicted, degraded, and slumbering brethren a spirit of inquiry and investigation respecting our miseries and wretchedness in this republican land of liberty, with the exclamation points in there. So it's almost like this sort of like, here's this grand paradox. It's just like, you know, and he's not talking to another human being. He's making an appeal to God. So he's not, you know, the God Almighty. I mean, he's the sole proprietor or master of the whole human family. So he's sort of like addressing this notion of the wretchedness of slavery, the way it's perpetrated here in the Americans and in North America in particular. And he's really like aware of slavery in the past. He's not somebody that sees slavery as the issue as much as this type of slavery and the fact that it has dehumanized human beings and castigated them as brutes. And yet those avaricious wretches are calling for peace. I declare it does appear to me as though some nations think God is asleep, or that he made the Africans for nothing else but to dig their mines and work their farms, or they cannot believe history sacred or profane. I ask every man who has a heart and is blessed with the privilege of believing, is not God a God of justice to all his creatures? Do you say he is? Then if he gives peace and tranquility to tyrants and permits them to keep our fathers, our mothers, ourselves, and our children in eternal ignorance and wretchedness, to support them and their families, would he be to us the God of justice? So he's saying, like, if you let this go, it's sort of like you can't be a good Christian and also believe in God. So you either believe in this or you don't believe in God. So he's really bringing it to this whole idea of the principle and profit right to the forefront of that. And then, he starts out his first article about the wretchedness in consequence of slavery. And he says, the Indians of North and of South America, the Greeks, the Irish subjected under the King of Great Britain, the Jews, that ancient people of the Lord, the inhabitants of all of the islands of the sea, in fine, all the inhabitants of the earth, except, however, the sons of Africa, are called men, and of course are and ought to be free. But we, colored people, and our children are brutes, and of course are and ought to be slaves to the American people and their children forever. Again, the same theme that we see before, but I would highlight that last part, our blood and our tears. And he uses that justification later on in his pamphlet, the whole idea of justifying almost like who belongs here and who doesn't belong here. This is a long passage, but this is a passage that I first saw a couple of years ago that caught my attention, especially as we were gearing up for the celebration or the commemoration of the Greek Declaration of Independence. And this is sort of like, here's a guy who doesn't only know history, reads the papers, he's very astute, he's very in the know. So he says, I saw a paragraph a few years ago since the South Carolina paper, which, speaking of the barbarity of the Turks, it said the Turks are the most barbarous people in the world. They treat the Greeks more like brutes than human beings. And in the same paper was an advertisement which said 8 well-built Virginia and Maryland Negro fellows and 4 wenches will positively be sold this day to the highest bidder. So he's sort of like, he says, okay, you're speaking of this one thing, and then you're on the same newspaper. So he's sort of poignant in his pointing out. And then the second paragraph, again, how well read he is, that I don't think a lot of our students today would be aware of this, is the suffering of the Helots among the Spartans was somewhat severe. It is true. But to say that theirs were as severe as ours among Americans, I do most strenuously deny. For instance, can any man show me an article on a page of ancient history which specifies that the Spartans chained and handcuffed the Helots and dragged them from their wives and children, children from their parents, mothers from their suckling babes, wives from their husbands, driving them from one end of the country to the other? So, he says, you civilized, here's 2,000 years ago, and, who's the brute here, So a really amazing kind of things that he extrapolates from this Greek War of Independence, sort of he has a different lesson of history. And he does go on with this idea of the Lacedaemonians and the Spartans. I find this to be a very nice sort of combination of saying this idea of Christianity, and he's saying who is a pagan and who is a believer, kind of a thing, really bringing it to his reader at the time. So I'm not going to go in and read all of it, but it's here, and I'll be more than happy to share all of this with the audience. So even that last part says the Spartans or the Lacedaemonians had some frivolous pretext for enslaving the Helots. I mean, they said, okay, they did something wrong to me. I had to do something. What did we do? I didn't do anything. He says. And to me, this is sort of like, he ends that second article by the fact that he doesn't want to necessarily be taken the wrong way. He says, I don't want to say, don't take this the wrong way. He says, no man may think that I am against missionaries, for I am not. My object is to see justice done at home before we go convert the heathens on the rest of the planet, so to speak. And he's sort of like, he creates this idea now that our problem is not necessarily just slavery. Our problem is, the perception of slavery. And then our problem is also this idea of ignorance, how uneducated we are. That's what he means by ignorance. The whole idea of, being educated. And we before the discussion, before the lecture, we talked a little bit about that, the whole notion of slavery as an institution. And yes, slavery has existed as an institution, but knowledge also has existed. And he does a very nice sort of like the beginning of that second article. It says, when we take a retrospective view of the arts and sciences, the wise legislators, the pyramids and other magnificent buildings, the turning of the channel of the river Nile by the sons of Africa, among whom learning originated and was carried thence into Greece, where it was improved upon and refined, thence among the Romans. So he's like, we're part of human history. You are denying this idea of human history, and we have gotten in this sort of like ignorance because of the lack of knowledge. He says, an ignorant father who knows no more than what nature has taught him, together with what little he acquires by the senses of hearing and seeing, finding his son able to write a neat hand, sets it down for granted. And he has as good learning as anybody. The young ignorant gump, hearing his father or mother, who perhaps may be 10 times more ignorant in point of literature than himself, extolling his learning, struts about in the full assurance that his attainments in literature are sufficient to take him through the world, when in fact he has scarcely any learning at all. So he says, put your head down and study some more. Don't just be praised by the little knowledge that you have. So a lot of times, in the conversations, with Mr. Danis, we have these conversations like, what can we do? Like, what can be done? And I think this is as close as sort of like a remedy of what can be done. And he's saying, what, not just this ephemeral learning, not just like, you learn a couple of things and you're showing off to your parents or to somebody who doesn't know really the real learning, and he really gets into it in this second article. He says, I must close this article by relating the very heart-rendering fact that I have examined schoolboys and young men of color in different parts of the country in the most simple parts of Mary's English grammar, and not more than 1 in 30 was able to give a correct answer to my interrogations. If anyone contradicts me, let him step out of his door into the streets of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Baltimore. No use to mention any other, for the Christians are too charitable further south or west. A little, just tongue-in-cheek argument here. But he says, okay, go to the major cities, and he has a great deal of authority. He's writing here, and he's challenging here the status quo, and he says, you know what? this education that we're providing students is horrific. They don't even know the simple grammar. So how can you expect to do anything without any kind of a educational experience? Colored people to have received an excellent education because perhaps some of them can write a good hand, but who, notwithstanding their neat writing, may be almost as ignorant in comparison as a horse. This is pretty drastic stuff that he's saying. Okay, so he moves forward, and I find this sort of the third article. He talks about the wretchedness and the consequence of preachers of religion of Jesus Christ. And I could say here, like I'm just putting this on the table for everyone. I would replace preachers here with current day politicians. So he's sort of like looking at preachers, and he's saying you're using Jesus Christ and you're using God as a way to sort of like, not teach the right way. You're doing it just in order for you to gain some kind of leverage against the people that are out there. Can there be a greater absurdity in nature, in particular in free Republican country? The issue is love for America again and republicanism. But the Americans, having introduced slavery among them, their hearts have become almost seared as with a hot iron, and God has nearly given them up to believe a lie in preference to the truth. And I am awfully afraid that pride, prejudice, avarice, and blood will be long prove the final ruin of this happy republic or land of liberty. You can look back at the last 20 years of our foreign policy, and you can put some of that in there, and you can just say how prophetic this is. So moving on to the last article, and again, I'm just pulling out some things up here because I could be going on for hours. The last one is about this colonizing plan. And to me, this one, how it relates to today, if the previous one was about the current politicians and choices that we make politically in some way or another, this is about this whole notion that we are dealing with about immigration right now. Here's this idea, that a lot of abolitionists were pushing for at the beginning of the 19th century was, as we were getting more and more freedmen, to begin to repatriate the freedmen to Africa. Let's not forget that the population of African Americans, it was a lot greater than white. So if you had this freed population of blacks, what would happen to the population? So this whole idea was to send them back, to send them to Africa, and that's why Liberia and Sierra Leone, both of those countries, were created as sort of like this colonization process. And he really, takes it on to this political, powerful man, Henry Clay, who was a senator from Kentucky, had presidential aspirations. He actually lost a vote. He lost out to Jackson in the election of 1830. So he takes on Mr. Clay head on, and he sort of like he really gives him this this push in the way. Did I bring obliquity upon the nation or the people whom I represented? Did I ever lose any opportunity to advance the fame, honor, and prosperity of this state and the Union? How astonishing it is for a man who knows so much about God and his ways as Mr. Clay to ask such frivolous questions. Does he believe that a man of his talents and standing in the midst of a people will get along unnoticed by the penetrating and all-seeing eye of God, who is continually taking cognizance of the hearts of men? So he has this very strong sense of redemption and of God. Like, you can fool people, you can do all kinds of wretched things, but you'll come back and you'll get you'll get your dues eventually. And he quotes Bishop Richard Allen, who's right here in Boston, somebody who was against the colonizing of Africa with freedmen. And he says that Africans have made fortunes for thousands who are yet unwilling to part with their services, but the free must be sent away. He says, here's the irony. The minute we become free, you want us to send us away, that we made all kinds of wealth for you. You keep us here. And this is where he makes the argument of somebody who has been here, somebody who has toiled the land, somebody who has with blood and tears given back to the community should have a right, should have the dignity of participating in the community that they're in. And I find this to be very much, some of the conversation about immigration and migration today, as people, just are constantly looking for dignity and participation. I declare to you, while you keep us and our children in bondage and treat us like brutes to make us support you and your families, we cannot be your friends. You do not look for it, do you? Treat us then like men, and we will be your friends. And there is no doubt in my mind, but the whole of the past will be sunk into oblivion. And yet under God, will become a united and happy people. The whites may say it is impossible, but remember, nothing is impossible with God. So just to close up, what are David Walker's and citizenship and redemption for the 21st century? I think that the themes that really come out throughout is this whole notion of this search for dignity through participation. He's asking the colored citizens of the world to be, first of all, self-cognizant and to have dignity and participate, reach out and grab participation. But you can't be ignorant. You have to educate yourself and you have to participate, breaking the modern chains of subjective passive citizenship. So in some ways, we're all today subjects. Very few of us are citizens. In order for us to be citizens, we have to be engaged. And if he can do it in the period and the difficulties he had, we can certainly do that. Principle versus profit. I find this to be, something that we're all dealing with on our daily basis, and we deal with it in a grand scheme of things, like as a United States and foreign policy. We deal with local politics. We deal with it on a personal basis every day, especially in today's society, as we're constantly striving to maximize what we can, and many times we sacrifice our principles. So this whole idea of democratic principle and citizen and the colonization of avarice and greed. And as I said earlier, the preacher of the 19th century to me is the modern politician, who uses sort of the legitimacy of God to promote his own interest and sort of like take care of your home first before you go out and preach to the rest of the world. Of course, I mentioned education, informed citizenship and participation. And the last point, the whole idea of colonization of the 19th century and the right to live and prosper where you want is a human right. Actually, it's a UN human right. And it really speaks to the issues of today and immigration and modernity. So thank you very much. You muted.
Okay, thank you so much. This was such a rich lecture, Petros. You did really show the relevance of this pamphlet and how all these issues are intertwined with today's situation, globally speaking. So I'd like to open the floor to questions to our audience. One question that I had is really interesting if we want to categorize this kind of pamphlet. It's radical, it's also kind of, I was wondering, because also religion is involved here, and he tries to show unveil the hypocrisy of the preachers. It seemed to me like he would be another apostle of Paul. Would you want to say something like that?
Yeah, he's a believer, right? I think he's sort of like, he's so genuine, and you can almost, like in his words, you can feel the fire that he's feeling. He's unafraid. He's very authentic, and he speaks with authority. He speaks with a great deal of authority. That passage that I read about education, he certainly speaks with authority, and he challenges. He's not, he's really a free man. I mean, he's not like, he's not servile in any way. He's not mincing his words in any way. And he's speaking from authority of the clear. So he has like this clear sort of sense to what he's saying. And he's unafraid. And in some way, you almost like, to me, like, when I read that part about, the way he refers to God, it's almost like, reading Martin Luther King towards the end, where he's like, I'm not answering to any man. I'm only answering to God.
It's interesting. It's very interesting that he connects the time and the environment to bring God, that at the time the colonies and the American landscape was believing in God, and it was very well written, very well appealing.
Yeah.
And even if you look at the way he uses the typographics, it's so powerful. He knows his stuff. I was, stunned by seeing the 4 question marks, the 4 exclamation marks, the italics, the bold in brutes, or when he wanted to emphasize. It's really remarkable for that time frame to see such a well-written article or pamphlet.
Yeah, it's a pamphlet, exactly. I think you said it. I mean, I think it's sort of like it's meant to wake people up. You know, I think you said it before, like, you know, before we started, you know, about Rigas Ferreros. So it's the same kind of a thing, like, you know, so like awaken, you know, this is what we need to do. We need to awaken. We need to, like, you know, and he says, you know, this is sort of like, this is what matters.
It's amazing the way he has his appeal and his whole theme, and unfortunately, our political leaders, our elected officials, have not even read what he has written.
Yeah.
We're doing totally the opposite.
Yeah, we're not interested. We're not interested in that. We're not interested in that message. It's not that we're not interested in that message, because that's a very, and I think that's what becomes, unfortunately, very relevant today. So it's almost like he wrote this today. You can take everything.
Exactly. And it's amazing. Even people and they're preaching and they're trying to bring equality, but they're not going back and looking at that and how off we've moved from the course.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to sort of, like, you know, that's the thing that was attractive to me, was what we need to extrapolate about, even, like, you know, ancient Greece. We just keep talking about antiquity, and he's saying, he's giving us the essence of that. He's giving us a stronger. I mean, we can find it, like, you know, people who know the Greek Revolution, for instance, we find this, like, you know, this kind of a thing, like, not only in Rigas Ferreros, but in Makriyanis. You know, we find this kind of, like, you know, this genuine, like, you know, on the ground kind of a thing of how we do this. And I'm not going to be moved because I've really paid for citizenship with my blood and tears. I think that's a very, very powerful kind of like a message today, to be that kind of, like, you know, that kind of an engaged person.
Professor Vavakash, you have done a super job in bringing this to light, at least from my perspective. And personally, I was impressed and mesmerized what this person 200 years ago had to say and how he articulated his message.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I don't think I did anything other than, like, I think that the power to his message is how true it is, and how truth really stays through the ages. And I think, you know, he's saying something that resonates today because it's genuine and because it's true. It's not. I mean, it's one of those, like, rare moments that we have as human beings to be not to be afraid. He's not fearful when he's writing this. He's not a person who's afraid. And I think that answers some of your questions, Mr. Danis, in the fact that sometimes a lot of politicians constantly make compromises that lose themselves, and it's that fear, whether it's the fear of being reelected, or the fear of losing some money, or the fear of, like, you know, ultimately losing out. And this person is not afraid. He's not afraid. No. So I think that's what.
He was genuinely had a purpose and a mission.
Yes, and this was also shown in the way he was pushing for this pamphlet to be spread out, unafraid of all the consequences, and as the same way as Thurius of Rigas was spreading all over the places, but still the message was there. We have to be awakened. We have to understand our own situation of wretchedness.
Comparing the Turkish to the Greek atrocities, and the newspaper, and then the next thing, it's an amazing thing. It blows your mind.
Exactly. And it's like, so like even, the thing that actually blew my mind, even that was the original thing, as I said, but in his next article, when he talks about education, and then when you're seeing like, a lot of like when you're in the classroom and like, a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, the lack of like, educational depth, and you're seeing it today and you're saying, okay, then how am I going to build the modern citizen today if I don't have history, if I don't have geography, and if I don't have grammar, and if I don't understand literature? So this is a person, he's 34 years old when he passes on, right? 34. And at 34,
34 years old.
He's read so much stuff about,
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
34 years old. I was amazed. I was amazed. So I have a lot of catching up to do.
It's an incredible job. You contextualized everything and the main points that are
unbelievable. Please, Professor Vavaka, send me the all those pamphlets. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
incredible. And so many years it has been kept in the dark. This amazing.
I share it since last year. I share it with all my students, my classes. Okay, I don't know if anybody read the whole thing, and it's only 80-some pages. It's not very long. The thing is that we don't have the necessary interest and the base for that. I think that's the problem. The problem is when he's talking about Lacedaemonians and helots, and you bring it up to a classroom today. I don't care if you're at Manual or Harvard or people would say, well, what is that? I have no idea. And that was part of the everyday language for him. So I think it's like, that's, like that's nothing that tells me.
I was going to send you a prologue of my book that very in a fraction of it, but it's really, it gives you have to live it in order to understand.
Yeah.
Anyway, and at some point you mentioned this question as the essence of citizenship or a good citizen. What can we do or what can be done? And this text brought all these perspectives on that point. What can we do as citizens and being informed and being aware?
It's an enormous job and almost impossible because of the unwillingness and the non-interest of our society. Unfortunately.
I don't know if there are any questions on the audience.
I think there's so much to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's, like I said, I could have gone on this because she has like so many passages in there, and the passages are very, very rich. Every single one of them really speaks to a lot of the things. And, he does have, he does take on some of even the icons of our socialization process. He sort of like takes on Jefferson, harshly on the notes to the state of Virginia. And he looks at Jefferson and he says, okay, what about this, this, and this? And he's having this open debate. And, this is a period with there's no Twitter, there's no social media of any sort, there's no radio, so the pamphlet is sort of like the mode by which you do this. And he's not afraid to take on Jefferson. He's not afraid to take on Clay. And Clay is living, by this time Jefferson is gone. But Clay is, an active politician, and he's sort of like, he's saying, okay, here are the streets of Boston and Philadelphia and New York. And he says, I'm not even going to dignify to go into places that, it's even worse than this. So he's really going in, and I assume that this is something he's writing for some time. And when he comes to Boston, he becomes a member of the Prince Hall, which is a Masonic temple. It's the oldest Masonic temple. It's still active right here in Roxbury. It was started by some African freedmen in 1775, I believe. So he's very much influenced, and he becomes sort of like part of the texture of the religious back and forth. And he has positive things to say for the English. He thinks that the English are better than the Spaniards or the French as far as colonization is concerned. So he's he's not rounding any corners. That's the thing that I found amazing about him. He doesn't round any corners. He's just to the point. To the point.
Absolutely.
And that's the only way to do it, really, to waken up people.
Yeah,
exactly. And the point that you made, that in the end this is an appeal to God, is really so important, and it expands so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been tremendous.
Just keep the conversation going, and I was very happy to be a part of this and continue the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Dennis,
congratulations.
Thank you for your support.
Thank you again for
Thank you for your support. So
and thank you, Mr. Danis, for your support. And we'll continue the dialogue, of course, in other series.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
For everything.
Maria, you have a question? Is that why you came on? No.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.